Hi. In this video, I'd like to explore the phenomenon of competition, especially with respect to our efforts to establish and secure hierarchical advantages over our fellow human beings. And more specifically, I'd like to examine both the benefits and the limitations of competition as a fundamental paradigm for our lives. And as usual, here's a table of contents for the material in this video. You can find this same table of contents in the description section of this video, along with links to the timestamps. But first, it's probably a good idea to talk a bit about what I mean by competition. Basically, as I said a minute ago, competition is about struggling to establish some sort of hierarchical advantage over our fellow human beings. Basically, struggling to win in some sort of contest, or at least struggling to avoid losing. Probably the easiest and most obvious example of competition would be in the domain of sports and games, which usually have very definite rules for regulating play and then for determining who winners and losers are. However, we also compete in many other areas of life, some of which are more about securing practical advantages for ourselves, and some of which are more about status. Probably most often it's a combination of the two. For instance, we compete for economic advantage, where in a capitalist society, winning is determined by the extent to which we can gain market share and generate profits, especially by providing our world with superior goods and services. In the political world, we compete for power, position, and status. In the academic world where I work, students compete for grades, and we professors compete for honors, grants, and promotions within the academic pecking order. And when we finally get home to relax, a lot of entertainment is basically about watching other people competing. To be the best singer, for instance, or the best dancer, or perhaps not to get voted off the island. Basically, no matter how you slice it, competition is a pretty big deal in our world. So in my mind, it's not a bad idea to ask, well, what's going on with all of that? Why are so many of us spending huge amounts of our lives within the competitive paradigm? But perhaps the more important question is, what are the limitations of that way of life? And what do we lose when we let it become excessive or all-consuming? So let's take a look at those questions one at a time. First, why is competition such a powerful force in human affairs? Well, probably part of the answer involves historical and even evolutionary factors. After all, pretty much all of human history, except for our modern era, has been governed by the logic of scarce and limited resources, where life was very much a zero-sum game. That is, where every winner on the positive end of the spectrum had to be counterbalanced by a loser on the negative end, so that everything eventually adds to zero. So, according to that logic, if there are 5 deer in the woods, but you need 8 to feed everyone, someone's inevitably going to be going hungry. And probably a lot of the competitiveness that fills our world today is rooted in those sorts of hard, zero-sum realities, which continue to exert force over our lives through a kind of historical inertia. Of course, there are probably still pockets of that kind of life in our world today. But at least in first world countries, very few of us feel the need to compete with each other for basic necessities like food. But the impulse to compete remains, now refracted into many other areas of our lives, such as our thirst for wealth, status, influence, power, attractiveness, popularity, etc. Basically, although competition isn't a life or death necessity anymore, we still do a lot of it because that's how the human race has evolved over the millennia. However, another part has to do with how we've been socialized, and more specifically, socialized into believing that winning in competitions of various types is the whole point of human existence. After all, as the bumper sticker says, "He who dies with the most toys wins," which could almost be a kind of motto for the competitive zero-sum mentality in our modern world. And when you think about it, a lot of the games we used to play, especially during our elementary school years, were basically about getting us to believe in it, and then to orient ourselves in the world accordingly. For instance, consider the game of musical chairs. Wow! If there ever was a game designed to teach kids that life is about competing for scarce resources, Musical chairs would pretty much be it, wouldn't it? But really, it's no more propagandistic than competing for grades is, or winning in sports for that matter. All of those activities taught us the subliminal lesson that being a winner is what matters in this world, and that we consequently have to try like hell to defeat our fellow competitors whenever and wherever possible. Because, well, that's what life's about, right? Well, in a way it is, or at least it was during that phase of life. And I think that the psychologist Erik Erikson's famous theory of psychosocial development helps to explain that a little more. Basically, according to Erikson, psychosocial development, that is, how we develop psychologically in relation to other people, consists of 8 basic stages that extend across the human lifespan. And each stage, in turn, consists of a thematic struggle or crisis. Here's a typical diagram of Erikson's 8 stages, and the stage we've been discussing so far has been stage number 4, industry versus inferiority, which, as you can see, extends through the elementary school years. Basically, industry versus inferiority has to do with discovering what we're good at, especially in comparison to other people. That's why kids of that age are so often fascinated with trying to see who can pop wheelies on their bicycles, for instance, or who can draw the best pictures, or run the fastest, or throw the farthest, etc., etc. It's because they're trying to figure out what their basic competencies are, what they're good at in comparison to their peers, which then sets the stage for the next developmental struggle in stage number 5, which is to construct a distinct identity, which is a more or less definite sense of who we are as unique human beings. But the main point about industry versus inferiority is that competition is a very natural, healthy, and important stage in our psychological development. And in fact, it very often brings out the best in us and gives us impetus to discover hidden reservoirs of potential and ability within ourselves. That's because the intensity of competing against other people has a way of pushing us beyond what we'd otherwise do. But, of course, as with anything else in this world, it's possible to overdo it and turn it into something pathological. And it's also possible for us to become stuck or fixated in a competitive Weltanschauung so that we never learn how to move beyond it. But the point is that competition in its own right isn't anything pathological or harmful. In fact, it's a healthy and constructive part of our larger human journey. That's because it's important for us to learn how to win in life, hopefully with grace and equanimity. And it's also important for us to learn how to lose, hopefully with an equal measure of grace and equanimity. Basically, it's important for us to become thoroughly familiar with both experiences, especially since it's pretty much inevitable that some days we're going to be winners and other days we're going to be losers. And so it behooves us to know how to deal with both of those inevitabilities. Of course, winning almost always feels better than losing does. And these days, it seems especially tempting for well-meaning adults to soften the sting of losing, especially for children. Perhaps by giving everyone in the school a participation trophy, for instance. But the fact is that we learn and grow from both sides of competition, both from the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat, as the TV used to say during my own childhood. Basically, they're both necessary variables in the human equation. And anyhow, when you think about it, a lot of the time we learn more from the experience of losing than from the pleasure of winning. That's because winning basically just confirms what we're already doing. It tells us, yeah, you did well, just keep doing it. But losing sets up a much greater challenge for us. It tells us that we need to change what we're doing somehow, perhaps by refining our skills or redoubling our efforts, or maybe by finding a completely different area for our energies altogether, one that's more congruent with our actual talents and capacities. So, although the logic of participation trophies may seem compelling and convincing, especially insofar as it shelters children from contact with one of life's more difficult realities, there are several basic problems with it. The first problem is that it generates an illusion of competence in cases where very little actually exists, which of course can easily set up all kinds of unrealistic expectations. But beyond that, When everyone's walking around with a trophy, it dilutes the distinctiveness of being a genuine winner of a contest. And as a consequence, it diminishes one of the great benefits of competitive activity, which is to experience not only a clear confirmation of our basic abilities and accomplishments, but also a compelling indicator of the deeper reservoirs of possibility and potential that may still lie within us. But perhaps most importantly, the logic of participation trophies often inadvertently teaches kids that instead of learning to face life's difficult moments with courage and then bettering ourselves as a consequence, what we should be doing is fabricating comfortable, self-serving deceptions and fictions, and even outright lies. And that is a hell of a nasty thing to teach kids. Mostly because it subverts one of the deepest lessons we can possibly learn during that stage of life. And to put the icing on the cake, I suspect that kids usually know that all of the participation trophies are a sham, and they're not fooled by them, not even for a minute. Most of the time, they know who the real winners and losers are, even when everyone's milling around the playground with a gigantic trophy. They know because it's part of their particular developmental struggle to know things like that, and so they're keenly attuned to them whether we like it or not. But of course, as life moves on, other themes eventually become more important than competition. That is, if all goes well during our psychosocial development. Of course, competition usually remains an inevitable part of life throughout most of adulthood. But the point is that as the years pass, it's hopefully no longer the main thing going on in our lives. And this brings us to the second question I posed at the beginning of this video. What are the limitations of the competitive paradigm for life? And what do we lose when we let it become excessive or all-consuming? Basically, when we become stuck or fixated on competition at the expense of life's other possibilities. Let's look again at Erikson's theory. According to Erikson, after industry versus inferiority comes identity versus role confusion, where we establish a sense of who we really are as human beings. Basically, our identities. But if we never pass beyond our desire to establish ourselves as winners of competitions, establishing our true identities will never really happen, because our whole perception of who we are will simply remain a bricolage of our past victories and defeats, a pastiche of our hierarchical relations to other people, but never anything authentic in its own right. Never anything beyond all of the awards and plaudits and status we've managed to accumulate, together with the losses we've managed to endure along the way. In essence, we'll never really know who and what we are, at least not in any deep or genuine way. But beyond identity versus role confusion lies intimacy versus isolation, which has to do with developing our capacity to experience deep, intimate connections with other people. But once again, if we remain fixated on competition for our life's meaning, that won't happen either, at least not in any genuine sense. That's first because it's pretty hard to develop genuine intimacy with other people if we don't have a more or less solid sense of who we ourselves are. Instead, all of our efforts in that area of life will simply amount to more competitive activity, more attempts to convince ourselves that we're winners rather than losers. Perhaps by hooking up with as many hot sexual partners as possible, or maybe eventually acquiring the ultimate prize of a trophy wife or trophy husband, so that others can easily recognize us as the winners we desperately want to be. But of course, that's very different from intimacy in any deep or genuine sense. And then, for Erikson, comes generativity versus stagnation, which has to do with contributing to the larger welfare of the world. But once again, that probably won't happen either. The reason is that it's hard to develop a deep desire to contribute to the well-being of the world if we never develop a sense of real intimacy with it in the first place. Instead, the world will simply remain nothing but the context for our victories and defeats, but not something that we would love deeply enough to give our very souls to help it grow and transform into something better. And finally, according to Erikson, the very last stage of life has to do with ego integrity versus despair, which in turn has to do with developing real wisdom. But the thing about wisdom is that it requires living as fully as possible through all the other stages of life, and not just fixating on the competitive one. Basically, if all we ever do with our lives is compete, we're probably not going to become wise because we won't have experienced life broadly enough to make that possible in the first place. And that lack of experience, together with its corresponding deficit of real wisdom, is what generates the final self-defeating paradox of excessive competition, which is that in our feverish efforts to prove ourselves to be winners throughout our lives, we only end up losing the most important thing of all, the opportunity to know genuine wisdom and to share it with the world. But at this point, perhaps the question is, well, if all of that's true, then how can we begin to move beyond the competitive paradigm and into the possibilities that lie beyond it, especially if we find ourselves stuck in the habit of constantly trying to prove that we're winners? Well, personally, I think that a good first step would be to realize how trivial all of our victories and defeats appear when we view them from the perspective of life's larger horizon, that is, from the point of view of reality. Let me give you an example drawn from my own experience. Personally, I like to walk in cemeteries, which I've done for many years. Decades, actually. Part of the reason why I like to walk in cemeteries is because the people there, God, they really know how to listen to you. Anyhow, in all of that time, I've never once seen a tombstone that listed someone's salary, or their net worth, or the kind of car they drove, or the kind of clothes they wore, all of which seems like a pretty big deal from the point of view of materialistic competition. But from the perspective of life and death, it turns out that it doesn't actually matter. In fact, from the point of view of our existential reality, all of it shrinks into complete insignificance. So what do people put on their tombstones, you might ask? Well, I'll tell you. The most common things are their names, which is basically their existential address. The next most common thing, their birth and death dates, basically when they got here and when they left. Fairly often, there are indicators of familial relationships, things like beloved wife or husband or son or daughter. Sometimes there'll be a marriage date. Occasionally, you'll see an indicator of what they really like to do in life, things like a little engraving of a fisherman in the corner, or maybe a tennis player, whatever. But the thing is that I've never seen a tombstone that said something like, top tire salesman in the Metro Atlanta region, 1987. Well, isn't that kind of strange when you think about it? So, what's the point? Well, the point is that one way of starting to move past the whole competitive paradigm, which can very easily start to become a competitive prison, is to start to see things in terms of the wider horizon of life and death, rather than from the comparatively narrow point of view of winning and losing. It's basically about shifting our frame of reference a little bit so that we can become aware of the true triviality of winning and losing and to begin to see things in terms of the big picture, from the point of view of life itself, for instance, or even in terms of our participation in all time and all space, basically from the perspective of reality. But of course, you don't have to walk in cemeteries to do that. You can just as easily stare into the infinite majesty of the midnight sky and ask yourself, what really matters in my life? And what seems to matter, but actually, it's not such a big deal after all. You see, doing that every now and then can be a way of starting to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. However, I find that another powerful and useful way of transcending the whole competitive paradigm has to do with shifting our relation to truth, especially since seeking truth can very easily degenerate into just another petty one-upsmanship contest. After all, one of the biggest competitive games out there has to do with proving that we're right and therefore winners, and while other people are wrong and therefore losers. And if you need a quick confirmation of that, just take a look at pretty much any internet discussion board. And probably most of us are so inured to seeing the truth through the lenses of adversarial debate and competition that it can be difficult even to imagine a better alternative. However, it seems fairly obvious to me that the kinds of truth that are meted out by debate and quasi-competitive argumentation are hardly ever the kinds that really move us where we actually live and breathe, and that consequently the kinds that change our lives. That's because when we debate and argue, we're hardly ever trying to experience any kind of higher or deeper truth. Instead, what we're trying to do is win, or to see someone with whom we identify win. In other words, we debate mostly just to feel validated in what we already want to believe in the first place. Basically, debate isn't about changing our minds, but about keeping them from changing. Basically about a kind of ego gratification that helps us feel like we're winners rather than losers. But of course, then the question is, but what happens when we start to let go of our need for that sort of thing? What happens when we let the truth become far more than just another egoistic one-upsmanship contest, just another way of gratifying our own vanity? Well, speaking from my own experience, I find that when I'm able to let go of the whole competitive, ego-gratifying relation to truth, it becomes much more playful and much deeper. It becomes more about allowing something to happen rather than forcing it to happen. In other words, truth becomes something to experience, something to savor with our entire being, rather than just another willful intellectual exercise. It turns into an aesthetic adventure, an ongoing metamorphosis of consciousness and awareness, and a portal into the fathomless depths of life itself. It becomes more like a poem or like a song, like a faint, elusive melody borne upon the summer wind, full of surprise and wonder and abiding reverence. That's when experiencing truth becomes a form of prayer, a way of paying deep homage to all that is and all that possibly could be. It becomes a dance on the edge of forever, an ecstatic celebration of mind, of soul, of heart, of body, of spirit, of all things welling up in us in this moment, this sacred, holy moment that is this exact moment, now. Maybe you can feel it, like your heartbeat. Now. And if you're saying, no, I can't, well, maybe the deeper reality is that you can. Even if it's a scary thing, and even if it takes a while, you can. And if all of this stuff sounds a little strange, well, maybe that's just because we're so damn used to setting our sights way too low in this life, and it takes a strange moment every now and then, first to jolt us out of our habitual complacency, and then to invite us into the deeper plenum of human existence. Just a thought. But in any case, thanks as always for watching, and as always, take care of your soul.